So welcome to Sumpter Gonzalez for the Open Door Initiative launch. What we want to talk about today, very briefly, is explaining the problems that led to the Open Door solution and some of the reasons and what we are looking to do. We want to talk about three areas. The first is the problems with the current funding mechanisms for indigent defense in Texas, especially in Travis County. Second, the solutions that we're proposing through the Open Door Initiative. And third, the challenge that we are going to put out for all other professional services that bill on an hourly rate. Lawyers, professional accountants, any type of service that can be tracked by a billable hour. Okay? Now, if I'm sitting in your chair, one of my first questions is, before we even begin, if I was in your shoes, I would want to know, namely, who in the hell are these people? And so to give you an introduction of what this office is about and who we do, it basically starts a few years ago where essentially this woman meets this dork and on the first day of law school basically gets introduced to him 5 more times over the course of that year before remembering his name. Now, this is shocking given the disparity in the photographs you've seen. But basically, she goes to law school to work in the public interest and the nonprofit world. He goes to law school knowing that he's going to work in the corporate world for typically a large firm doing some sort of commercial litigation. He tricks her into dating him, and then she in turn tricks him into leaving the corporate world and going into the nonprofit sector. He tricks her back by the fact that she's a vegetarian and moves her to Texas, and then she gets the last laugh because they moved to Austin, not Texas. So as a result, everybody's happy. Okay, so Corinne and I get married in 2001. Shortly thereafter, we go to Kirby Lane and figure out a business plan. Spent quite a bit of time deciding what we should or shouldn't do, but we had basically 3 core values. The first was that we needed to have some sort of a law firm that helped low income and working poor. 2, that we treat all of our clients who are both wealthy as those that may not be as wealthy the same exact way. And number 3, we figure out some mechanism to turn it into a business and do a public interest for profit. So that way we are not dependent upon the whims of government funding or a grant or fundraising. Okay? Now, as a result, the last one's been the tricky part, and this is basically what we'll get to in the Open Door Initiative. In the past 8 years, we've grown in terms of size of the number of the office. We've also grown in terms of expanding our mission. The Open Door Initiative is basically a mechanism for doing 3 things related to our mission. The first is to provide a greater access to legal representation for the working and middle class. Already there are programs in place to fund indigent defense in Texas. But those that don't qualify, basically if you earn more than 150% of the federal poverty guidelines, then you are left out. And there is no mechanism right now to prevent a very large classification of people that is growing in the midst of the economic crisis. Second is to allow law firms to use a formula based upon the living wage calculations that Taylor Cook from our office has prepared. And third, it's to introduce the social work and the legal model of practice that our Director of Social Work, Ethan Schindler, has worked on in the past 6 months, and to provide an open source access to those resources that we've already spent time and resources and effort conducting. Now, so why do we launch this today? A couple of reasons. And when we talk about our first discussion area, I want to be able to talk about a confluence of events. First is the economic problems that are happening that are colliding with the systemic problems of indigent defense Texans in Texas. Economic problems to begin with. Number 1, the credit markets are frozen. Again, this morning the reports are that banks have ceased lending, although that the general interest rates have gone down. The notion is that people are still very, very conservative with capital. 2, layoffs will continue to be announced. I mean, even the NFL is cutting 10% of their workforce as announced last night. Dell, local manufacturers, not only are laying off and having voluntary reductions in work staff, they're also on hiring freezes. The third is private businesses are in survival mode. People aren't hiring, and people are looking to the government to be able to solve issues of liquidity. This now contracts with the systematic problems that we've got with indigent defense. The first being the state doesn't pay for indigent defense. Number 2, the counties are having to increase their budget for indigent defense. And third, anything involving public safety is a political priority. Anything involving a mere constitutional requirement, not as much. And so in the midst of the economic downturn, the situation will get worse. The numbers got released a few months ago that all 50 states that use IOLTA funds, basically all the money that lawyers take in corporate law firms when their clients give them money, and the poor get to earn their dollars from public funding through the interest on that money. What's happening, first of all, is there's a compound problem. Interest rates have plummeted, so basically the amount of percentages you're getting on those IOLTA accounts has reduced. And then second, the trust balances are declining. So there's not as much money to be able to get interest on to fund legal services. More businesses are putting down smaller retainers so that money is not being left in these non-interest-bearing accounts for the corporate clients. And law firms are withdrawing the funds as collections dry up. So you've got basically a greater need for legal services for the poor right now and smaller resources and access. It's happening in Texas. I think we had projected $26 million for our funds for indigent defense, and that's now shirked to $20 million. In some states, it's gotten much, much worse. This even requires people to cut staff, and you're seeing it around the country, especially when it relates to criminal defense. In Kentucky, Ed Monahan files suit to allow defenders to refuse cases. In Florida, basically it's gotten to a huge head where Miami-Dade is trying to stop representing clients so they can provide better defenses for those they currently represent. The average case per lawyer for felonies has climbed to nearly 500 per lawyer. Missouri, the public defender system has not added staff in 8 years, although their number of cases has rapidly increased, and they're declining misdemeanors that won't result in jail time. Minnesota, hiring freeze of all public defenders. There's already been 19 vacant positions, and 61 other positions may be cut. Maryland, the Office of the PD basically stopped contracting with public defenders or any private counsel when there's a conflict. So basically, when there is a conflict of interest, no one can represent folks that are indigent. In Missouri, the public defenders have seen such a high turnover rate because they can only pay them $35,000 a year. Caseloads have risen from 12,000 to 88,000 in the past 7 years. Michigan, class action to basically stop doing indigent defense because no one's spending enough money and they can't employ investigators to be able to help attorneys. Vermont, small state, but they're already limiting half of their budget for public defense, and the caseloads are already 25% too high. In Texas, thanks to Andrea Marsh and the Fair Defense Project, basically Roth-Gary now requires the appointment of counsel to prevent counties from deliberately delaying the appointment of counsel to prevent folks from asking for lawyers. Counties are now budgeting for the increased cost of compliance. There's two big states people are looking at. One is Tennessee, basically where the Spandinger Group noticed that indigent defense attorneys were receiving less than half of the money given to prosecutors, and when they calculated the amount of services through in-kind type services from federal, county, and agencies, they were receiving 4 times as many resources than indigent defense counsel. And Georgia, where right now the jury is deliberating about the death sentence for Brian Nichols. And the case was delayed. Brian Nichols is where a young man who, in the midst of a current situation in court, went back into court and murdered a judge and other court staff. There wasn't much of guilt-innocence because he had confessed, but there's a tremendous amount of mitigation and mental health issues that were involved. In the midst of the litigation, the prosecution declared that they were going to seek the death penalty, had a witness list of 320 witnesses, and hired the nation's top forensic science and jury consultant experts. But the legislature, when the defense had asked for equitable funding, was told that we don't need to give a Lexus level of defense to this person. So they sought the judge to basically put a stay on the trial until funds were then committed. The jury found him guilty, and as of last night, they finished closing arguments, and the jury is now deliberating as to whether he will die or receive a life sentence. Georgia started to be the linchpin as far as states and public defenders saying, we can't handle anymore. The disparities in fundings are too great, and we're just going to stop representing people, and we'll let the system destroy itself and not be part of the machinery of death or injustice for any longer. So that being said, I hardly doubt you're going to find anybody from any of these offices being able to go to Washington and appeal for some sort of a bailout. In Texas already, when you've got problems being able to insure poor kids, our expectations are that no one's going to then want to be able to provide money to defend the accused, especially those that may be guilty. Our belief and what we've learned is that in any system there is a day of reckoning. And when you don't want to care for the poor, and when we look at health care, let's see what happens.